little girl alone in my little world who dreamed of a little home for me. I played pretend between the trees and fed my house gas sparking leaves and laughed in my pretty bed of green. I had a dream that I could fly from the highest swing. I had a dream.
This presentation is sponsored by the Minnesota Child Protection League, united in action to protect all children from exploitation, indoctrination, and violence. The CPL educates people on issues that threaten the mental, physical, and emotional safety of children. In that light, we are dedicated to defeating Minnesota House File 826, the Safe and Supportive Minnesota Schools Act, a falsely named bill. Bullying in schools is a hot topic today. Bullying is painful, real, and can have lifelong consequences for both the bullied and the one who bullies. In fact, in some cases, the parents of students who have taken their own lives will attest that their child was bullied. However, the exploitation of a tragedy has been used to create a manufactured, quote, crisis over the issue of school bullying. Using a crisis is for the stated purpose of forcing cultural and sexual, quote, values, attitudes, and behaviors, end of quote. Minnesota already has laws in place prohibiting bullying and requiring all schools to have and use a bullying policy. Some Minnesota school districts have been using character building and mutual respect lessons. According to the 2010 Minnesota Student Survey, school bullying is on the downturn. 93% of students say they feel safe. Other statistics also show that bullying is decreasing nationally. Unfortunately, however, Governor Dayton and legislative leadership have chosen to ignore the strides Minnesota schools are making in addressing bullying. Instead, they have used a manufactured bullying crisis to create an entirely new agency within the Minnesota Department of Education. This is to transform and manage the, quote, climate, end of quote, in every school statewide. This agency will oversee school training, curriculum, reporting, and remediation practices. I will address more of this overreaching expansion of government a little later. Governor Dayton, in response to special interest groups led by the GLBT community, created, by executive order, a task force on the prevention of bullying to develop a plan to stop the crisis for which there is no data. The recommendation of the Governor's Prevention of School Bullying Task Force was to pass sweeping legislation, House File 826, led by Representative Jim Davney, and its companion, Senate File 783, led by Senator Scott Dibble. Senator Dibble, who sits on the task force, spearheaded the fight for the legislation in the 2013 session. By creating a massive new agency within the Department of Education, this bill seeks to re-educate and impose a radical set of diversity and social values on our children from pre-K through 12th grade. House File 826 actually passed the Minnesota House of Representatives in 2013 on a party-line vote and came very close to passage in the Senate. The clock ran out as the Senate adjourned, but legislative leadership will readdress HF826 in 2014 with Senator Dibble and Representative Dabney determined to see it pass. The governor's waiting to sign it into law. To fully understand the urgency of this issue, let's take a step back and look a little deeper. They call this legislation the Safe and Supportive Minnesota Schools Act, and nothing could be further from the truth. This bill is harmful to children, a threat to parents, and is a state takeover of Minnesota's independent school districts. The Minnesota Child Protection League affirms that the Safe and Supportive Minnesota Schools Act is unfunded, unfair, and unsafe. Before looking at these affirmations regarding this threatening bill, we must first take a look at the enforcement system. An entire new government bureaucracy is created for compliance. Here's a picture of what the top-down system would look like in Minnesota. The governor's task force would direct the work of the School Climate Council that will establish the, quote, norms, end of quote, the mandates, if you will, for the system. The Climate Council will be supported by the work of the School Climate Center at the Minnesota Department of Education that will also be the point of contact and enforcement with the local school districts. The local school districts are required to comply and gain the cooperation of any local parent advisory committees who are responsible for community buy-in. And the local school districts have to pay for everything. What a scheme. That brings us to our first affirmation. House File 826 is unfunded. What is the price tag for all of this? The Minnesota Office of Management and Budget has estimated approximately $40 million every biennium, but more accurate estimates based on local school district calculations could be double that amount due to retraining, new curriculum, and personnel costs. This mandate on our schools is totally unfunded and will have to be paid for from already tenuous budgets or increased school operating levies on local real estate taxes. We already have a statute on the books that requires districts to adopt anti-bullying policies, and the Commissioner and the Minnesota School Board Association has sample policies for them to use. Did the parents, teachers, and schools in Minnesota rally the Capitol for this heavy-handed legislation? Were they the ones who designed this legislation? No. Just when districts are beginning to see the positive results of their own anti-bullying programs and policies designed for their local communities, Governor Dayton wants to tell them to start over. Governor Dayton needs to be reminded that he's already paying against the $867 million that he borrowed from Minnesota's public schools to fund his budget. Is he really going to send them a bill for $40 million every 2 years when he owes them already? And what a tragedy that Governor Dayton has chosen to hijack the school day and use it for the promotion of special groups when Minnesota is responsible for one of the highest education performance gaps in the country. Senator Dibble and the governor's task force will tell you that this anti-bullying legislation is locally developed. It simply is not true. Almost identical language has or is being offered as legislation in other states. It points to the fact that a single agenda is being handed to all the state education departments and state legislatures. The Illinois Senate rejected an almost identical bill last year. Let's look a little deeper into the bill to see what this educational restructuring is all about. According to House File 826, bullying means intimidating, threatening, abusive, or harassing conduct that is, quote, objectively offensive, end of quote. There is absolutely no definition of objectively offensive. Bullying includes invasion of privacy, defamation, and emotional distress. Using the words emotional distress allows bullying to mean anything that makes you feel bad. House File 826 includes cyberbullying, the use of electronic technology and the internet, including but not limited to the transfer of a sign, signal, writing, image, sound, or data. Will there be any time for teaching if teachers are responsible for monitoring the social media of their students 24 hours a day? House File 826 protects 19 specifically named actual or perceived classes and statuses and any others included in the Minnesota Human Rights Act. Why would an anti-bullying bill specifically name some groups rather than just before all kids equally? Under House File 826, bullying may be simply, quote, asserted or alleged, end of quote. And House File 826 forever protects the anonymity of the person reporting the bullying incident. Bottom line, a student may anonymously report Susie for allegedly causing emotional distress to Johnny by saying something that was objectively offensive based on what Susie perceived about Johnny. I think we can safely assert that the definition of bullying in this bill is far outside what is typically considered bullying. Name-calling, telling secrets, failing to choose someone on their team, they all cause emotional distress and under this bill would be classified as bullying. What if child B who has simply offended child C by talking about his or her own personal family viewpoint. That brings us to our next affirmation. House File 826 is unfair. Interestingly enough, House File 826 does a stellar job of bullying just about everyone. House File 826 bullies students. Students attend class and school events in the constant fear that while in the classroom, on the internet, or at extracurricular activities, and while transported, they are ever being watched and listened to for prohibited conduct in regard to their speech and actions. Their actions can simply be what they write in a school assignment or their body language. This bill, if it becomes law, will trample on the rights of children to voice their conscience and exercise their own family values. Students are trained and encouraged to report each other. There are no protections for data privacy and no provisions for destruction of the bullying incident reports. There is every reason to believe that a wrong word or unproven allegation could become part of your child's permanent transcript and follow them when applying for college or a job. House File 826 bullies parents. Parents are not required in this bill in any case to be notified whether their child is the accuser, the accused, or the bullied student. Meanwhile, the values and beliefs of the child may be attacked with no one to defend or protect them. The learning environment is one of fear and intimidation. Teachers are also bullied. Teachers are forced to be on the constant lookout for signs of bullying, including 24/7 monitoring of social media. Failure to report can mean disciplinary action. Adherence is actually being discussed as a future requirement for teacher license renewal. The classroom curriculum is rewritten for the, quote, whole school climate, end of quote, experience, and teachers are forced to give up more precious academic time in favor of required state-directed, quote, prevention and intervention, end of quote, education. Independent school districts no longer create their own anti-bullying policies according to the demographics in their own communities. A massive new center within the Minnesota Department of Education called the School Climate Center will oversee and assist local school districts with compliance, receive the summary data of the bullying incident reports, and help to establish the local school's curriculum changes. The School Climate Center is funded at $1 million every other year and is referred to in the Governor's Task Force report as, quote, perpetual, end of quote. The School Climate Council is the mothership of the system that will, quote, establish the norms and standards for prevention, intervention, and support around the issues of prohibited conduct, end of quote. Almost everyone on the council is a government employee with their livelihood depending on their cooperation. This brings us to the re-education and remediation process for pre-K through 12th grade students who express their conscience and beliefs opposing the values of free sexual expression and diversity. Our third affirmation is House File 826 is unsafe. The re-education and remediation system advocates for the nice guy approach in the beginning using the reconciliation process, where the student apologizes and shows contrition and the offended student accepts the apology. If the accused student does not cooperate or maintains innocence or exercises conscience, additional responses to their prohibited conduct will be employed under remediation. Remediation may mean forced reading assignments that re-educate the alleged bully and may be emotional and highly offensive in nature. It may mean sitting face to face, knees to knees with the alleged victim as he or she tells the accused how badly they've been offended until the accused breaks down and apologizes. If reconciliation or remediation does not bring about a defeated spirit and a change of thinking in the accused, they may be referred for psychological counseling or even mental health treatment. Expulsion is also an option. Because the entire system includes participation with law enforcement, a child may be referred to the judicial system. What I will be discussing over the next few minutes is difficult to share, but you must understand that it is the real world for our children. For the purposes of this video, we have tried to be sensitive, but for our children, they'll be confronted with shocking material, and you will not be there to protect them. As adults, we are embarrassed and uncomfortable with this subject matter. Please try to keep in mind what effect this will have on children who just want to laugh and play and feel secure. The Governor's Task Force report states that, in regard to bullying, quote, effective strategies will promote values, attitudes, and behaviors that acknowledge the cultural and diversity of students, including understanding the nature of human sexuality, end of quote. This means that children are no longer free to express their own values, attitudes, or beliefs, or even hold them. A new set of values, attitudes, and behaviors will replace their own religious, cultural, or family values, or else. The task force report even goes so far as to say the behaviors of the parents may have to be changed. Developmentally appropriate programmatic instruction, language from House File 826, is encouraged to help students value diversity. Developmentally appropriate is code language for highly controversial, gender-bending, sexual diversity indoctrination. It can cause strong moral offense and may harm the fragile developing minds of children. According to the most recent brain research, young brains are not fully capable of handling sexual information in a rational manner until they approach 20 years of age. Rather, the information is disseminated throughout their bodies in a sexually charged message invoking feelings, emotions, and stimulation that they are totally incapable of processing in a safe manner. The undeveloped brains are shaped and rebuilt by what they see, read, and experience. The brain mislabels fear and shame arousal as sex. Imagine requiring the teaching and viewing of this type of sexually titillating material for a child from the time they're in preschool until they graduate. They could be dangerous to others, let alone themselves. Currently, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, 44% of rapists are under the age of 25. The common thread is exposure to sexually explicit material beginning at a young age. Children will be subjected to sexually explicit curriculum that is used to desensitize their minds with regard to sexual diversity, sexual orientation, and gender identity. The material is shocking, morally offensive, and physically unsafe. We have evidence that the material already being taught in many of Minnesota's schools meets the FBI standards for what pedophiles show children to break down their defenses. In the name of anti-bullying, House File 826 will flood the classroom with much more. Minnesota statute currently states that sexually explicit materials are harmful to minors, and that it is in the best interests of minors that such material be restricted to them. Unfortunately, however, schools and teachers are exempt from Minnesota obscenity laws. There are no legal constraints over explicit material that may be presented to children in the classroom. This is a best-selling book in its third edition, used to supplement material currently being used as part of the curriculum in the St. Paul area schools and other Minnesota public school libraries. Again, we caution you at the explicit content we are about to show. This is what is classified as developmentally appropriate. For a 10-year-old. Who will advocate and protect the child from exploitation and harm by this new system when a child expresses a contradictory belief on an issue of sexual diversity and is reported for bullying? Depending on the severity of the prohibited conduct and their level of cooperation, children may be remediated, disciplined, or assigned an intervention even without their parents being notified. In fact, if the school decides to inform the parents, the student may elect, even at the youngest ages, not to have his or her parents notified. The fact of the matter is, Children can and do bully each other. Genuine bullying must be addressed and stopped. We do not need a new state bureaucracy to do that effectively. But under the governor's bullying bill, something more ominous is brewing. Your child may be re-educated, remediated, disciplined, sent to the psychologist, referred to mental health treatment, and shown sexually explicit material by a teacher who is exempt from state obscenity laws, all for an alleged incident of bullying that may have been little more than your child saying, "Children need a mommy and a daddy." So what is the real reason there is such urgency in passing a bullying bill for a crisis that no one can prove? And why does Senator Dibble say our current statutes are, quote, ineffective and accomplish nothing, end of quote? Let's again look to the governor's task force report to see what they recommend be changed in state statute, keeping in mind that only one of 19 protected classes was significantly represented on this task force. Perhaps that will give us a clue to what would make our law effective and accomplish their goals. According to the governor's Prevention of School Bullying Task Force report of August 1st, 2012, quote, statutory and policy reform should focus on, among other provisions, the following, end of quote. A. Sexual orientation and gender identity or expression, as defined in this report, should be added to Minnesota Statutes 127A.42. B. Amending Minnesota Rule 3535.2300 to include sexual orientation and gender identity or expression as defined in this report. C. Redefining discriminate in the Minnesota Human Rights Act to read, the term discriminate includes to segregate or separate, to create or condone a hostile environment, and for the purposes of discrimination on the basis of sex includes sexual harassment. And D. The Commissioner shall take regular steps to advise Minnesota school districts and administrators of their obligations under the Equal Access Act. The common thread in HF826 and each of the aforementioned statutory changes recommended by the governor's not locally developed task force is to enforce approval for one particular group. This law is not intended to protect self-conscious or shy students, fat, insecure, or poorly dressed students. When it comes to bullying, this legislation wants to impose its values, not protect children equally. We have the opportunity to see exactly what this legislation will do to Minnesota schools if enacted by looking at what happened in Minnesota's largest school district, Anoka-Hennepin. In 2010, that district was targeted and sued by the U.S. Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Education, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the National Center for Lesbian Rights over its supposed lack of an effective anti-bullying policy. Under massive media distortions, a frenzy of organized social activism, attorneys' fees, and legal pressure, the district settled rather than fight the lawsuit. The resulting federal consent decree was described by U.S. Assistant Attorney General Thomas Perez as, quote, a model for schools across the nation, end of quote. Governor Dayton's Prevention of School Bullying Task Force report of August 1st, 2012, refers to the Anoka-Hennepin settlement as a guiding document, and the recommendations for the Safe and Supportive Minnesota Schools Act, HF826, came directly out of the governor's task force report. Under the consent decree, the Anoka-Hennepin School District is being forced to comply with the same mandates that can be found in the governor's bullying bill. It is thought that the cost to the district of compliance may reach $1 million per year for each of the 5 years they are on probation and may ultimately result in closing schools. We know from the Anoka-Hennepin School District's tragic experience exactly what safe and supportive really looks like. The bottom line is this. House File 826 is not locally developed anti-bullying legislation. This is a federal vision being forced upon our children in an effort to redefine the entire culture and value system of this country. It pays no attention to the innocence and delicate nature of a child's mind and its healthy development. It disregards and offends family values and freedom of conscience. This legislation favors special groups, and the curriculum to facilitate this cultural change is waiting in the wings. This is about children, our children. The Minnesota Child Protection League cannot overstate how important it is for all of us to take a stand against this legislation. How precious are these little ones? It is our responsibility to protect them. Make sure that House File 826 is on your radar. Tell everyone you know that we can protect our children by vehemently opposing this bill. Share this presentation with others at coffee and wherever you go. Call your Senate and House members and your local school board members and tell them about this bill. Tell them to let it die in the Senate. And share this presentation to your friends across the country. Remember, we are the blueprint for the nation. A few years ago, the Minnesota Department of Children, Families, and Learning, the old name for our Minnesota Department of Education, put out this brochure showing the head of a small child being cradled in someone's hands. The title reads, "Their minds are in our hands." The Minnesota Child Protection League says it's time to take them back.
Long walks in the dark through woods grown behind the park. I asked God who I'm supposed to be. The stars